All right, everybody, we are back for the second half of our public policy course section all about the death penalty. And we're going to be going a little bit more into depth on kind of the death penalty in the United States, how and when it's used, and other issues involved with the death penalty. And once again, I'd like to reiterate that there are an entire semester-long courses about the death penalty taught in criminal justice programs around the country. And this is just one small section. So we are doing a very shallow dive into many of these issues. Now, one of the things that different polling firms have been polling about for decades is whether Americans support the death penalty or not, right? And this is from one of the more popular, more famous, more prestigious polling firms, Gallup. They have done periodically a poll of the American people to ask them whether they're in favor, whether they support the death penalty or not, right? And as you can see from this chart behind me, it roughly follows the crime rate, right? Increasing in the 60s and 70s, peaking in the mid to late 90s, and then dropping ever since. So in other words, for the past 20 to 30 years, Americans have becoming less and less and less favorable towards the death penalty. Now, one of the issues with polling on this is that the questions are often framed in a way as to eliminate alternatives. So if you'll notice here, the question on your screen is exactly as the pollster asked it. Are you in favor of the death penalty for a person convicted of murder? Yes or no? Right? But what that doesn't provide the respondent is, well, what's the alternative? And so many researchers are kind of concerned that people who are answering these questions believe that the other alternative, i.e., the choice here is death penalty or no punishment at all. In which case, they say, yeah, I favor the death penalty. They shouldn't just have no punishment at all, right? When questions are asked in a different way, i.e., if somebody is convicted of a murder, would you support giving them the death penalty or life in prison without the possibility of parole? Support for the death penalty is much lower than here. So even kind of with the question increasing the favorability of the death penalty like it is in these Gallup polls, the support for the death penalty is still roughly 50-50. When you ask it in another way and provide that alternative of life in prison without parole, the support for the death penalty drops well below 50%. And again, this is Americans, not worldwide or any other jurisdiction. Now, how often do we execute people? Once again, you'll see a very vague correlation with the overall crime rate in the United States. This graph has both new death convictions, i.e. sentencing someone to be executed, and executions actually carried out, right? So if you see the new death sentences imposed peaked in the early 90s, and the actual executions, the actual number of people that are executed, peaked in the late 90s, and both have been kind of plummeting ever since, which also goes along with the crime rate, which also correlates to people's, the public's views on the death penalty. But it is getting much, much, much more rare, both to get sentenced to death, to actually be put to death, and all those things. Now, it is not kind of geographically distributed around the country evenly. Okay? There are essentially 51 different jurisdictions in the United States. The 50 different states and the federal government. 28 of those still have the death penalty as actually like legal. It is a possible sentence in their criminal justice systems. Roughly half of the states that still have that as a legal option just kind of don't do it anymore. Like, it's still theoretically possible, but they haven't actually carried out an execution in a very, very long time, right? And this graph here shows you which state is which. So the states there in kind of the gray-white color, those are states where they don't have the death penalty. It's not even a legal option. No matter what happens in any court case in those jurisdictions, people cannot be given the death penalty, right? Now, these states in the orange with the white stripes through them, which might be a little bit hard to see on your screen, but if you look closely, you can probably kind of pick it out. Those states have the death penalty in theory, but they haven't actually executed anybody in 10 plus years, right? So that includes South Carolina, North Carolina, Nevada, California, Oregon, right? And then in solid yellow or orange, whatever color you want to call that, those are the states where you can have the death penalty and they have actually executed at least one person in the last 10 years, right? So Texas, Georgia, Tennessee, the three states I showed the list for earlier, Missouri, Ohio, the federal government. Those are all states that still have the death penalty as a legal option, and they use it, okay? Now, how do we perform the death penalty in this country? Well, I said on the last slide that there are 28 jurisdictions that still have the death penalty as a legal possibility, right? And in all 28 of those, 27 states plus the federal government, lethal injection is either the only source or the only possibility for the death penalty to be performed, or it's at least an option. Okay? There are many states where lethal injection is the only option. If you are sentenced to death and you are actually executed in those states, you're going to be given a lethal injection. In some states, they have an option. And I believe in all of the states with the option of how the execution is to be carried out, the option is given to the person being executed. Right? So if I'm sentenced to death in the state of Texas, or the state of Tennessee, or the state of Florida, or whatever, they might say, hey, we're sentencing you to death. Here's a list of 2 or 3 or 4 options. How do you want us to do it? Right? And in every single one of those cases, remember, lethal injection is on the list. Okay? Now, for a long time in this country, executions were carried out via hanging. Right? This is where you see this in the movies all the time, especially Westerns. People are led onto a wooden scaffolding, ropes put around their neck, usually a hood's put over their face, and then they're dropped. Theoretically, breaks the neck, kills people instantly. This is no longer an option, but it was an option and was actually used as recently as 1996. Okay, the last execution via hanging was in the state of Delaware in 1996. So very recently, nowhere near the kind of Old West stereotype, right? Now, things that are still an option around the country include electrocution, right? Electrocution, similar to the guillotine, was designed as a more humane way to execute people in, I believe, the 1920s. But this is where you kind of strap people to a chair, again, usually put a hood over their face, and then run many, many thousands of volts through their body, which stops their heart and kills them. This is on the list as an option in 9 different states. The gas chamber is still an option. This is where the condemned is locked in a small chamber, and some sort of gaseous chemical is introduced into that chamber, which causes them to suffocate and drown or otherwise expire, right? Firing squad is still an option in 3 states. Once again, made famous in media, movies, etc., especially war movies. This is where the condemned is stood against a wall or a post or a tree, and usually 4 or 5 people with rifles will take aim and shoot them. The newest edition, and as of time of recording, still kind of legally going through the process of being approved as a method of hanging, is nitrogen suffocation. So there are many states that are having trouble obtaining the drugs used in lethal injection. Doctors refuse to prescribe it, or pharmacies refuse to sell it if they know that those drugs are going to be used for the death of people that have been sentenced to death by a prison. So the drugs used in a lethal injection can be very difficult to come by and expensive. So this is being proposed as kind of a cheap, easy alternative to trying to obtain the drugs for a lethal injection. And with nitrogen suffocation, basically, the prisoner is strapped down, a mask is put over their mouth and nose, and that mask is pumped full of nitrogen, and that is the only thing that the person can breathe. And the human body doesn't notice the difference between breathing regular atmospheric air and breathing nitrogen, because the air around us is actually mostly nitrogen already. The air you're breathing right now as you watch this, unless you're on the International Space Station, which if you are, please send me a message or a comment, because I'd love to know that this video was seen in space. The air we are all breathing right now is about 60% nitrogen. Our body is used to breathing nitrogen. It likes breathing nitrogen. It only uses the oxygen that we're also breathing in, but what we're breathing in is still mostly nitrogen, right? So if we give it 100% nitrogen, our body still breathes in and out normally. Our body kind of doesn't notice anything wrong. It doesn't notice that we're not getting any oxygen with the nitrogen. And thus, we kind of slowly lose consciousness. And then eventually, if we go without the oxygen long enough, we pass away. But from those who have kind of gotten close to dying via nitrogen suffocation, but then live to tell the tale, apparently it's relatively easy, not stressful, not painful. If you don't know what's happening, you don't realize something's wrong until it's far too late. So the other good thing from the state's point of view is that nitrogen is incredibly easy to obtain. So they don't have the problems with obtaining kind of the substance to perform the execution like they do with lethal injection. Now, as of time of recording, this has been used once, maybe twice in the state of Alabama. I believe it is currently in front of some court, whether it's the state Supreme Court or the federal Supreme Court, I don't know, but the state of Louisiana wants to use this now. So by the time you're watching this, who knows, maybe this has become a very popular new way of executing people. But as of time of recording, it's only been used a very small number of times, again, once or twice. But it is kind of becoming more popular in the states that still perform executions as a method of performing executions. So, now, here's where we get down to the nitty-gritty. Here's where we get down to, okay, what does all this mean, right? Is the death penalty something that is justifiable or not? And one of the arguments I hear a lot is that I'm in favor of the death penalty because I don't want to pay for somebody to have to live in prison for the rest of their life. I want my tax money spent on better things, so just kill them so that we can get rid of them. We don't have to pay for their prison and food and all that stuff for the rest of their lives. And that's kind of exactly backwards. Because depending on jurisdiction, it costs roughly 3 times more to put somebody to death than it does to keep them in prison for the rest of their lives. So on average, you're spending 3 times more of your tax dollars to give somebody the death penalty than to just keep them in prison for the rest of their lives. And there's many reasons for this. The cost of the actual execution itself is a tiny fraction of the total cost there. Tiny fraction, right? Most of the cost, well, a larger percentage of the cost is having to keep them separate, having to keep prisoners sentenced to death in a separate facility with kind of additional or different guards. They can't just be kept in the general population with murderers who were sentenced to life in prison. The majority of the cost, though, the largest single contributor to this increased cost of the death penalty is the increased legal process that the Supreme Court said, remember in that Furman v. Georgia, Gregg v. Georgia scenario from earlier in this section, part of the kind of compromise with, okay, you can start doing the death penalty again that we had in Gregg v. Georgia was it is only constitutional to have the death penalty if those sentenced to death have kind of guaranteed appeals and guaranteed hearings and guaranteed this and guaranteed that as part of a process to make sure that justice is actually being served, that person is actually guilty, that person actually deserves the death penalty. And those processes that the Supreme Court has dictated are required in order for the death penalty to meet the bounds of the Constitution are incredibly expensive. So it is much, much, much cheaper from a taxpayer perspective to get rid of the death penalty than it is to have the death penalty. Now, another big issue with the death penalty is racism. The death penalty is not applied evenly based on skin color. To pull one kind of glaring statistic out, African Americans, black people, are 12% roughly of the United States population. But they are 42% of the people sentenced to death. 12% of the population, 42% of the people sentenced to death. And it's not because they murder people more. Okay? There have been studies about whether race plays a role in, take a huge group of murderers and see whether the skin color of the offender affects the death penalty. And they found that, yeah, indeed it does. There is, similar to what we talked about in the previous section, there is some differential offending. But that's nowhere near enough to account for all of the eventual change or difference that we see in people sentenced to death versus people not sentenced to death. But interestingly, even more important than the race of the offender is the race of the victim. The race of the victim has actually an even greater impact on whether somebody receives the death penalty or not than even the race of the offender does, which already has a fairly significant impact. But if the victim is white, especially a white woman, the offender is much more likely to get the death penalty. If the victim is black, the offender is much less likely to get the death penalty. So both the race of the offender and the victim have a pretty significant impact on whether a convicted murderer is given the death penalty or not given the death penalty. And the final issue we're going to talk about in this section on the death penalty is the problem of innocence. So people who are convicted and sentenced to death are given appeal after appeal, and it takes a lot before they can be sentenced to death. And even with that, there are still 200 plus cases just since 1976 and the reinstatement of the death penalty in Gregg v. Georgia. 200 cases, as of time of recording, where people have been sentenced to death and then later found to be innocent. In some cases, it was found that the victim was still alive. In some cases, it was DNA evidence that came out. In some cases, it was, somebody else was confessed to the crime and had evidence that they were the ones who really did it. But 200 people, just since 1976, have been proven to be innocent, even though they were waiting on death row. So some percentage of the people that we are actually executing are actually innocent. These 200 people, there is zero chance that everybody who is factually innocent is represented in those 200 people who have since been released. There are more than those 200 people that were sentenced to death, but some of those people were just unlucky and were executed for crimes they didn't commit. It's nowhere near 100%, of course. I'm not saying that it is. But importantly, it's not 0%. We have executed at least some innocent people since 1976, and maybe we'll never know that they were innocent. But they were. Researchers and criminal justice professionals have attempted to kind of estimate what percentage of all the people that have been executed since 1976 were factually innocent. And estimates vary, but it's somewhere around 1.5 to 4%. Most of those estimates kind of cluster around that range, which is a very small percent. In other words, the vast majority of people who are executed are guilty of that crime. But is a 1.5 to 4% chance of them being innocent is that okay? You listening to this or watching this right now, I want you to think to yourself, is if we execute 100 people, and somewhere between 1 and 4 of them were factually innocent, and there's no way to know which 1 to 4 people, but 1 to 4 of those 100 people were innocent, is that kind of morally and ethically justifiable to make sure that we are using the death penalty and spending all that taxpayer money and all that time and energy for zero deterrent effect to execute the other 96 to 99 people? I'm going to leave you with that thought. I really appreciate you watching. I'll see you in the next one.